The number one question I get asked on my channel is if I'm a beginner, where do I start for fantasy? And I've always been hesitant to make a video on this because I think the answer is very, very different depending on who you are and where you are in your reading journey. Like what you like and what you don't like will depend where I think the best starting place is. So today I have a handful of recommendations and I'm going to go through each one and explain the type of reader I think that this would be a very, very good start for. But I do think, as a whole, all of the books on this recommendation list are a pretty good place to start if you're trying to get into fantasy. My first and easiest recommendation place to start is YA fantasy. YA fantasy is written just a little bit more accessible than a lot of adult fantasy. It is not as complex sometimes in terms of magic systems and world building, and it typically has a character that you're following pretty strongly. My two recommendations for this are the Red Queen series and Fireborne. I think Red Queen reads a lot more YA than Fireborne does, but they are both young adult series, so if you don't know what YA means, it means a book's target demographic is roughly 12 to 18-year-olds. You're typically gonna deal with a lot of the themes that people in that age group go through, so like finding your first love and heartbreak and thinking adults are all evil and things like that. Red Queen, I think, is a really good place to start because of the world building aspect. Now, this does follow a love triangle, and it definitely has a heavy plot emphasis on the romance in it, but we're following Mare Barrow, who is born of red blood. In this world, there are red bloods and silver bloods. The red bloods are essentially the bottom of the totem pole. They are the grunt force. They are the poor people. The silver bloods are the royalty, and they are born with magic in their blood. Something happens where Mare accidentally finds out that she has magic when she's not supposed to because she's a red blood, and this happens in front of the king and the queen, and they have to do something with her, make a story up, because rebellion would happen otherwise. Because now a red blood all of a sudden has magic, so can they be looked down upon the same? This just has a really expansive political and world building plot to it that I really, really enjoyed and think that it'll be a pretty good place to start if you're looking to start with YA. Fireborne is a YA but covers the themes of an adult book like there's no tomorrow. I have never read a story that covers power corrupting better than this one does. Themes of revolution and societal privilege and just a really, really, really deep story. In this story, we're following Annie and Lee, who were children when there was a revolution and the regime was overthrown, and now there's a new regime. They have grown up as orphans together. No one knows this, but Lee was actually a noble family. He was a family of the old regime. He's hiding that because people will kill him for it. And Annie is lowborn. They are training to become dragon riders. And in this new regime, the whole thing is anyone can be a dragon rider. It doesn't matter where your bloodline is, who you are, blah, 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 blah. But that's not really how it works because we see Lee be treated differently due to the privilege of his upbringing that even no one knows about. But like, he's still being treated differently. This story does have romance in it. It does feel YA, but it has just such heavy themes that remind me of adult story that I think that this would be a really great place if you're looking for a stepping stone from YA to adult in fantasy. Next up on my list is the Greenbone Saga. I think this would be perfect for a beginner fantasy step because it is set in our world. It is an urban setting. The other thing that makes this feel a lot more accessible is the magic system is kind of similar to steroid use, so I think it's really easy to wrap your head around. In this, we're following the Greenbone clans. We're following a island that lives a little bit more in the past than others. They are set in their ways, and there are clans that run. They're essentially mafia clans that run the power and the politics on this island, and they are fighting for ultimate control of the island. We're following the No Peak clan and what that means for them and rooting for them throughout this entire story. Essentially, the world building is Jade, and people who can use Jade put it on their body and then get extra strong. But it's not like wizard magic. So it feels a lot more accessible and easy for your brain to wrap around. I really enjoyed this series and I think that it is a perfect step. Next up is Ash of the Sun, which I think is perfect because it only follows two characters. You're following a brother and sister, and so it feels kind of familiar in that aspect, and they are pretty compelling characters and the writing is pretty accessible in this. The other reason I think that this could be kind of easy to read is if you've ever watched Star Wars, there is some inspiration with the magic system from Star Wars, so it might be easier to wrap your head around if you've seen it there to then understand it here. In this, we're following our two siblings who are separated when they're young. The Empire came and took Maya away when she was really little because she was sick, and they said that they could help her. She has since then grown up within the Empire drinking the Kool-Aid, becoming one of them. And then we follow Geir, who is her brother, who witnessed Maya being taken away, hated what that did to his family, and has since then joined the cause to take down the Empire and wants nothing but to see them destroyed for what they did to his family. This, of course, leaves the siblings on opposite sides of the war, and we get to watch what that means for them when they finally meet up as adults later on. There is some romance in this, there's some sapphic romance in it, but it's definitely a subplot. I think this is a very easy to follow one, and the characters have my whole heart, so I hope that they do as well for you. While we're kind of talking about easy magic systems, I think a perfect place to start is also Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. It wouldn't be a beginner fantasy recommendation list without Brandon Sanderson making it on. Mistborn introduces you to hard magic systems in a very easy way. It introduces you to a magic system with rules, something that is a big part of a lot of other fantasies, but it's done so effortlessly. It feels very easy to read, and you aren't left confused within this one. We're following Rin, who is a orphan peasant living on the streets, when she gets an invite to join this band of thieves for a heist to take down the overlord, who is kind of seen as evil. That's all I'm going to tell you about it. But like, this is such a great place for beginners. It is often shelved in YA or adult, and I think that's because of the accessibility of it. And I mean, it's Sanderson. You can't read fantasy without having read a Sanderson at some point. I guess let's move on to my romantasy picks. I think if you are a romance reader, the perfect place for you to dive into fantasy is with a romance story. One of my biggest recommendations for this has always been A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Yes, this is hyped, but just like Sanderson, it's hyped for a reason. Sarah J. Maas balances romance and world building quite well for me. I think that yes, this is romance heavy. The main storyline is the relationships and things like that, but there is a complex world being built around those romances, and it feels very natural to escape into. You never feel like you're overwhelmed by the world building. It just, as you go further into the story, more and more is shown to you, and it works. It feels very, very natural. So if you're a romance reader, try A Court of Thorns and Roses. Essentially, we're following our main character, Feyre, who accidentally kills a fae. So then another fae comes and asks for a life debt and takes her to the fae world, which she is absolutely terrified of. But as she explores the fae world and gets to know the fae, she realizes that not everything is what she's been told or as it seems, and there is something going wrong in the fae world that she might need to fix. Another romance I would suggest is Serpent and the Wings of Night. This is a vampire fantasy romance, so in some ways I think would be familiar because we all know about vampires and some vampire lore, but the vampire lore is definitely done a 180 and changed a lot. Like, they have wings in it, so like it's not just your typical vampire lore, but they're still blood drinking creatures, and there is still like a little bit that would feel familiar to you. In this, we're following the main character, Araya, who is a human in this vampire world. She was adopted by the vampire king for some reason, but she lives her life in fear because she's the only human in a vampire court, and that's kind of scary. So when the Kajari opens up, she enters into it. The Kajari is a tournament where at the end of it, the goddess of night will gift you one wish no matter what it is. So Araya wants to wish for power so that she is no longer scared. But in order to win, she has to survive and defeat all the other vampires, and she's just a mere little human. And of course there's romance in this. I love the romance in this. It's very swoon-worthy in my opinion. Next up on my list is Along the Razor's Edge by Rob J. Hayes. This is actually the only indie I think I put on this, but this story is a character-driven story in my opinion, and if you like the character, it is such an easy story to follow. It does still have a hard magic system. It does still have some epic world building, but the main amazingness of the story is our main character Eska and the friendship ties in it. So I think that because this is character driven, if Eska works for you, because she might not work for everyone, you will fly through this book and you won't even realize everything that you just understood. In this, we're following Askara, who was a sorcerer in the war. She was on the wrong side though, and she was on the losing side. So when the white flag is raised, she is taken to the pit to be a prisoner for the rest of time. The pit is a gigantic hole far, far, far away from the sun, and her magic is taken away from her as well. Askara will never give up, and she is going to escape the pit, and you're gonna watch her do it. There's also an isolated setting, which I think makes it easier to follow in some aspects, because as the series goes, goes, the world building expands, but in this first book, you only have to understand some of the magic, some of the characters, but you don't have to understand, like, all of the politics and all the different places. Like, sometimes traveling books can get so confusing to me because I'm like, am I supposed to remember that they went to place A, place B, place C, place D, and, like, all of the little moments in between? So an isolated setting, I think, will help. I really, really love this series. It's one of my favorites, so I hope that you do too. In similar vein, I have The Will of the Many by James Islington. I think that this is more complex than this one, but another character-driven story that I think if you really vibe with the character, you will be okay with some of the confusing elements, and by the end of it, I think that you will understand it. This isn't the most beginner-friendly, but I think if it worked for you, it would work for you. Like, this is probably a little bit more intermediate, but once you've tried a few of these, I think that this would be a really good one to pick up. In this, we're following our main character who is an orphan, and he has been sent to one of the most prestigious schools in order to spy. But the thing is, although he's spying for someone, he has different ulterior motives, and the world will not know what hit him when he finally has his identity revealed. I just think that if you get lost in the character, this would be a really, really perfect place to start. A very, very character-orientated book. Next up, we have The Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. This, again, is probably, I'm leaning towards some of the more intermediate side, but we're following 3 POVs, and they rotate. I think something really important for beginner fantasy is having some kind of consistency. So I think maybe these really epic multi-spanning POVs that just come, like, every 100 pages you might get a brand new POV would be really hard, but these stories that have 3 POVs or 2 POVs that just alternate so you always know what you're getting into would really work, I think, for a beginner, because it would just help your brain organize things, I think. This one, we're following 3 siblings. I think sibling stories are easy to read because a lot of people understand sibling relations already, so it, again, feels familiar. We're following this where the king has been murdered and his 3 children have been set on a destiny by him. They don't know what happened to the king and they're trying to figure that out, but they're on opposite sides of the world and they haven't talked to each other in a really long time, so how are they gonna do that? We follow Caden, who is the heir, and he is in a school setting. He's in a priesthood trying to learn specific ways to help him be a ruler, be calm at some points. We're following Valen, who is a warrior. He's also at a school setting learning how to be a soldier and work in a squad. And then we're following Adair. She cannot rule because she is a female, but she is the one who knows the most going on. And I think the world building in this was very, very epic and very sprawling, and I was confused at times, so I think you kind of have to let yourself be confused. But I think the characters in this, again, were just very compelling, and because they rotate, I think that if you're looking to get into very, very more epic fantasy, this would be a great place to start to maybe get you used to having these really, really big sprawling worlds that, like, not everything always makes sense in. I have another Sanderson to recommend as well, Elantris. Again, this is 3 POVs that rotate pretty evenly, and it's a standalone at this moment in time, which I think also works because you're not worried about moving on to a series and all the information that you need is given within this story. In this, we're following the city of Elantris that used to be run by, like, gods, but now is a place for people that are sick. There is a curse where you kind of become like a zombie. Anyone who gets this sickness, this plague, is stuck within the city of Elantris because there's no way to kill them. Our main character, who is the prince, gets this plague, so he's in the city of Elantris now, trying to figure out how to survive because he's kind of like a zombie now. His wife is now widowed before she's even met him and has come to this land to be married to him, and now is trying to figure out where her place is without him. And then we also follow a priest that is doing some sus things, in my opinion. I really enjoyed this. This was actually one of the first adult fantasies that I read, and it's still one of my favorites, so I think that it would be a really good place to start. It's a lot of politics. If you're looking to get into, like, political stuff, this definitely. And the last one on my list is the Daevabad trilogy, which again has 3 POVs that are consistent. You're rotating through them. I think it's really, really easy to follow. I actually believe in the first book there might be only 2 POVs, but in the second and third it expands to 3, which makes it even more accessible if the first book is only 2. This is also somewhat set in our world. It is technically urban fantasy. It feels like Alice in Wonderland almost, where you're, like, going to a magical place. Even though it's, like, set in our world and urban, you're in a different world. Or like Narnia, you're going somewhere that's magical. In this, we're following Nari, who is a thief who accidentally does some magic and summons Dara, who is a magical djinn. Dara really quickly realizes who she is and takes her back to the wonderful city of Daevabad. Nari essentially is the heir to the throne, but this should not have happened. She is half human, and this is really, really weird because her line was killed off a long time ago in a revolution. So now Nari is going back as the heir to the throne, but there are already people in power. There's already a king, and there are definitely some interesting politics at bay. We also follow Ali, who is the second son to the current ruler of Daevabad, and what that means for him, and we watch these two as they really figure out their place in society. And the city of Daevabad is very, very beautiful and magical in my opinion, and was such a wonderful introduction into what a magical world can be without feeling overwhelming. I read this series pretty early on in my fantasy journey as well. It did take me a while. I do think the first like 50 pages are a little bit rough, so I'm always hesitant to recommend it as beginner fantasy, but once you're in Daevabad, I think that you'll be hooked. Those are all of my beginner fantasy recommendations. I think that this is a great place to start. There's a bunch of different starting places for you depending on where you are in your journey, and I really, really hope that you enjoy most, if not all of these. If you have any beginner recommendations as well, leave them down below for other people to peruse the comments. I will leave another recommendation video right here for you on the screen if you're interested in checking out more recommendations from me. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video and you'd like to leave me an emoji just to say you were here, leave me a little chick emoji, like a little baby chicken. He's so cute.